Imagine spending years designing a spacecraft capable of traveling hundreds of millions of miles through space, thousands of calculations, advanced computers, teams of highly trained engineers, a rocket launch, a 9-month journey toward Mars. Everything seems to be working. And then just as the spacecraft finally reaches its destination, it disappears. Not because of an asteroid, not because its engines suddenly exploded, but because two teams were effectively speaking two different mathematical languages. One was using metric units, the other was using English units. And that simple mismatch helped doom an entire mission. This is the story of the Mars Climate Orbiter. In December 1998, NASA launched the spacecraft toward Mars. Its mission was ambitious. The orbiter was designed to study the Martian atmosphere, monitor weather and climate, photograph the planet, and eventually help relay communications for another spacecraft, the Mars Polar Lander. For months, the Mars Climate Orbiter traveled through space toward the red planet. During that journey, engineers had to constantly calculate exactly where the spacecraft was going. This is extremely important. When you're traveling millions of miles through space, even a tiny navigation error can grow into a huge problem. Imagine aiming a laser at something extremely far away. Move your hand just slightly at the beginning, and by the time the beam reaches its destination, it may be nowhere near where you intended. Spaceflight works in a similar way. Small errors can become enormous over great distances. To keep the spacecraft on course, engineers use small thrusters. These thrusters made tiny adjustments to the spacecraft's trajectory. Every adjustment had to be carefully measured and fed into navigation calculations. And this is where the problem began. A piece of ground software associated with the spacecraft produced thruster-related data using English units. Specifically, the data was expressed using pound-force seconds, but the navigation system expected that information in metric units. Newton seconds. The numbers were being exchanged, but they did not mean the same thing. Think about someone telling you a distance is 100. You assume they mean kilometers. They actually mean miles. The number itself looks perfectly normal, but your understanding of that number is completely different. Now imagine making that mistake while navigating a spacecraft toward another planet. Over time, the navigation calculations began pushing the predicted trajectory away from reality. The spacecraft was approaching Mars on the wrong path, and the danger wasn't immediately corrected. On September 23, 1999, the Mars Climate Orbiter prepared for one of the most important moments of its entire mission. Mars orbit insertion. The spacecraft needed to fire its main engine and pass behind Mars. If everything worked correctly, Mars's gravity would capture it into orbit. Controllers expected the spacecraft to approach Mars at an altitude of roughly 150 kilometers. But after examining the data, NASA determined that the spacecraft had apparently passed much lower, around 60 kilometers above the planet. That was dangerously deep. NASA estimated that the spacecraft needed to remain above roughly 85 kilometers to survive. Instead, it had gone far below that level. As planned, communication disappeared when the spacecraft passed behind Mars. Controllers waited for the signal to return on the other side. They waited. Nothing. They continued searching. Still nothing. The Mars Climate Orbiter was never heard from again. Investigators began asking the obvious question, how could something like this happen? This wasn't simply a case of one person typing the wrong number. NASA's investigation found a deeper problem. There had been a failure to properly recognize, communicate, test, and correct the mismatch between the units used by different parts of the system. The root problem involved software output using English units when the interface required metric units. But the larger lesson was about systems. Checks that should have caught the problem didn't catch it. Communication between teams wasn't strong enough to stop it. Software interfaces weren't adequately verified. Warnings and navigation discrepancies didn't lead to the correction that was needed before it was too late. NASA itself emphasized an important point after the failure. People make mistakes. The real danger is when the systems designed to detect those mistakes fail too. And that's what makes the Mars Climate Orbiter story so fascinating. We tend to imagine catastrophic engineering failures as something dramatic. A rocket engine explodes, a computer completely crashes, a major component breaks. But sometimes disasters begin with something incredibly ordinary. A unit of measurement, One system expects one thing, another provides something different. And because everything around that mistake is incredibly complex, the consequences become enormous. The Mars Climate Orbiter had successfully launched from Earth. It had survived months traveling through space. It had traveled all the way to Mars. And yet, near the finish line, a basic mismatch between measurement systems contributed to its destruction. Today, the story is one of the most famous examples of why engineers obsess over standards, testing, communication, and verification. Because when you're building something as complicated as a spacecraft, it's not enough for every individual component to work. Every component must understand every other component correctly. A number isn't useful unless everyone agrees on what that number means. A calculation isn't safe unless its assumptions are understood. And a tiny mistake isn't always tiny. Sometimes it can travel all the way to Mars,